All right, today we're going to unpack the political life of George H.W. Bush. You know, he's a fascinating figure. On one hand, you've got the guy who managed the end of the Cold War with this incredibly steady hand. But on the other, his principles back home, well, they often seem to shift with the political winds. So we're going to explore this evolution of a president who was, depending on what day it was, a man of conviction, a total pragmatist, and sometimes a politician of major contradictions. And really, that's the big question about his whole career, isn't it? Was George H.W. Bush a leader with a steady, unwavering moral compass? Or was he a pragmatist, a politician who just adapted to whatever was happening around him? Because when you look at his decades of public service, his positions on some really huge issues, they changed. And sometimes they changed dramatically. So let's follow that journey. Okay, first up, his shifting social views. It's like a journey across the entire political spectrum. And believe me, this is where we see some of the most incredible changes in his thinking, all the way from his early days in Texas right up to his time in the Oval Office. I mean, just look at the distance he traveled on this. In 1963, he's a candidate in Texas, and he's actively opposing the Civil Rights Bill. Fast forward to 1990, and now he's President Bush signing the Americans with Disabilities Act into law. We're talking one of the most important civil rights laws of the modern era. That's a complete 180, a really remarkable journey in less than 30 years. And if you think that was a big shift, check out his stance on abortion. Early in his career, he wasn't just okay with family planning, he was a vocal advocate. He actually introduced the Family Planning Services Act back in 1970. But by the time he got to the presidency, his position had done a complete 180. He was squarely in the pro-life camp, against abortion in any form. You know, this wasn't some minor tweak in policy. It was a total, fundamental change. All right, let's talk about the economy. And you can't talk about Bush and the economy without mentioning that one infamous pledge. Read my lips, no new taxes. But the reality he walked into as president was, well, it was a lot more complicated. And it forced him to make choices that would define his entire legacy, and frankly, end up costing him big time. So here's the reality he was facing, and you can pretty much sum it up in one giant number. During his 4 years in office, the U.S. national debt jumped by $1 trillion. He was juggling a recession, the massive savings and loan crisis. I mean, the pressure was immense. And that fiscal pressure is exactly why, in the end, he broke that famous campaign promise and agreed to raise taxes. And that economic situation created this huge political problem for him. By 92, his administration was looking at the data and seeing signs of recovery. But that's not what people were feeling on the ground in their everyday lives. And this created this perception that he was just disconnected from what ordinary Americans were going through. It was a narrative his opponents seized on, and it was a major, major factor in him losing his re-election bid. So, okay, if his domestic record shows a leader who's kind of all over the place, his foreign policy is where a lot of people see a totally different person, a steady, experienced hand at the wheel. And you gotta remember, he was president during one of the most chaotic and transformative moments in modern history, the actual end of the Cold War. Just think about it, the Berlin Wall falls, and instead of taking a victory lap, which he totally could have, he gives this really measured response so he doesn't provoke a very fragile Soviet Union. He just expertly managed the collapse of the USSR, talking to both Gorbachev and Yeltsin, and then he masterfully builds this huge international coalition to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. We're talking about high-stakes, world-changing diplomacy here. And this quote really sums up his whole vision for what came next, for the post-Cold War era. For Bush, this wasn't just about winning. It was a chance to build a whole new world based on countries working together, on open trade, and on shared values. It was a pretty optimistic and, ambitious vision for America's place in the world. That same tendency to try and find a middle ground, the one that worked so well for him in foreign policy, well, it also showed up on some really tough issues at home. For instance, on gun control, he did something that surprised a lot of conservatives. In 1989, he banned the import of certain semi-automatic weapons. Now, at the same time, he was saying he was committed to gun owners' rights. It was a classic Bush balancing act. But his story with the NRA was definitely not over. And here's the kicker to that story. A few years after he left office, in 1995, he publicly resigned his lifetime membership in the NRA. He literally ripped up his card. And the reason?
The NRA had sent out a fundraising letter that called federal law enforcement agents jackbooted government thugs. For George Bush, a man who was a lifelong public servant, that was a line that just couldn't be crossed. Period.
So when you try to define the Bush legacy, you're left with this leader who was constantly in flux. We've seen the big shifts on social issues, the economic pragmatism that forced him to break a huge promise, and that really steady hand in foreign policy. So when you put all those pieces together, what does it actually tell us about the man and his presidency?
Which brings us right back to that big question we started with. How should history judge a leader who changes this much? Was he a pragmatist? Somebody who was just responding to reality as it changed around him? Or was he a politician who was willing to abandon his principles when it was convenient? The answer, much like the man himself, is really complex, and it leaves you with a pretty big question to think about. What do we truly value most in a leader?